I want to talk about the 5 priorities of a Christian man. I'm going to start with a story about one of the defining moments in my life. And I apologize if I've told this story before, but you probably haven't been through that many of my videos, have you? So here I was being interviewed to be on staff at a church, and they had been through a number of staff changes and such, and I had been working a secular job for a period of time, and I thought, oh wow, this is great. This is probably the very next call that God has for my life. And it was definitely a defining moment in my life. Here I was by myself, sitting in front of the single most influential minister in our city. And he had been probably the most influential minister for many, many years. Anyway, so here I was sitting there and talking about doctrine and where I stood on certain things or what I believed to reassure him that I was possibly the man he was looking for. So it came to the part in our conversation where he said, now, what we're about to talk about, you need to be completely honest with me about. Because if you're not, this may cause serious problems. So I was bracing myself. I really had no idea what he was about to say. In fact, I was quite relieved when he said it until I realized I had to tell him the truth. Anyway, so I was sitting there waiting for him to drop the bomb here about what is he going to ask me about. And he said, now, you have to understand that the ministry takes number 1 priority in your life. And it really set me back. After I got over the shock of, okay, this isn't such a bad question, then I realized, okay, here I am sitting in front of who many people would consider the leader with the greatest opportunity that a young man could be offered, and I'm about to disagree with him. And I wasn't ignorant about it. I wasn't disrespectful about it. I wasn't sassy about it. However, I had to dig deep and take a deep breath and say, I'm sorry. I have to disagree with you on that. And it likely cost me the ministry opportunity of a lifetime. However, had I have not told him the truth, I would have been a liar. And Jesus doesn't speak too highly of liars. So it leads me to the 5 priorities of a Christian man. And I cannot take credit for these. It wasn't until years later that I ended up meeting with a retired minister who to this day is still one of my deeply respected mentors. And I remember time and time again struggling with different things or discussing, where my role in fulfilling the Great Commission is, or fulfilling God's call on my life, or having an outlet for ministry. And he would say the same thing to me every time. And he would say it in such a way that it was like, do you not remember you already told me this like 50 times? Like a kid that you're trying to tell, a disobedient kid that you're trying to tell to put their shoes on because it's time to go, and then you go and you do something else and you come back and they're still not putting their shoes on. It's like, yeah, you've told me 100 times. Anyway, Tanya will get a laugh about that because she knows what I'm talking about. But here it is. Number one, as a Christian man, you are responsible to maintain your relationship with God. Priority one. The nice thing about that priority is God allows us to choose where and when, for the most part, that we have our time with Him, or our time in prayer, or the time that we spend reading His Word or listening to His Word being preached. Okay? Number one, your relationship with God. I think that's pretty much a no-brainer. Where it gets a little dicey is how people define that. And back to my story, I think that there are many church leaders that define, and even church goers, so to speak, people that go to church, and they define their relationship with God by how much they do at their church, or how much they do for their minister, or how involved they are in church activities and things like that. I think that's great, but it has to be an expression of a heartfelt relationship and commitment with God. Okay? So number one, your relationship with God. Number two, if you're married, your relationship with your wife. You have stood before God and made a covenant before God to join together as one flesh with your wife. And people say, oh, well, it's not my responsibility to make my wife happy. Well, actually it is. Paul said it's better if young men don't marry, because then they can only please the Lord. However, if they do marry, then they have the responsibility to please their wife. So look it up, check it out for yourself. Maybe you disagree with me. But number two, your relationship with your spouse before God. Number three, your children. Now, why is number three and number two in the order that they are? Well, your children are more vulnerable than your adult spouse. So while they are young, yeah, you are responsible to make sure they don't drown and get swept away in a river, whereas your spouse probably can fend for themselves and swim to shore. Your spouse probably can make their own meals, and your children, when they're young, you need to take care of them and help feed them, because they don't know how to feed themselves or dress themselves if they're teenagers. However, your children will, if Jesus tarries, eventually grow up and learn to take care of themselves and eventually leave. And then you're left with your spouse, who, if you've ignored for 18 years of your children's lives for putting your children first, you got some serious catching up to do. So, number two is your spouse. Number three is your children before God. And you are, as a man, responsible for taking care and providing for your wife and children. That doesn't mean that your wife can't work if she chooses to or anything like that. I'm not saying that. Your wife is an equal, a joint heir with Jesus, so to speak, with you. However, you are, as Christ to the church, you are the head, and that means that you are to love your wife and to give yourself for her. That means you prefer her. That means that you take the dirty jobs, and that means that you change the diapers of life, so to speak. So, 1, God, 2, wife, 3, kids. Number 4, your employment. Now, this is where people may agree to disagree about. However, your employment may or may not be ministry. Your employment may very well be secular. And that you have a responsibility to your boss or to a company, or if you own the company, you have a responsibility to your customers or your shareholders or even your own employees. And as a Christian man, they do deserve, and you are required to be honest, to have integrity, to work hard, to be diligent, not slothful in business, the Bible says. Actually, that was my daughter's memory verse this week. Not slothful in business. That's pretty interesting. That means that you're the one that's willing to go the extra mile and to do the extra things that nobody else wants to do or nobody else can do. So, your employment to provide for your wife and kids. Now, that doesn't mean that you worship your job or you're so motivated for your career that you sacrifice everything else and you neglect your wife or your children. However, a well-balanced job is a successful job, whether that's ministry full-time and you get paid from a church or a Christian organization, or if you are being paid by a company or business or the government or running your own business and from your customers. That leaves number five. Number five, the volunteer work that you do as a Christian, which would be in most cases ministry. Now, that does not mean that you are neglecting ministry on behalf of God through Jesus Christ. In fact, your relationship with God is actually ministry to God. And your relationship to your wife is actually ministry as well. It's ministry to your wife, and it's ministry to your wife on behalf of God. Because being the husband, you have a ministry to fulfill as a protector, as a provider on behalf of God in the role of husband. The same goes for your children. So, as the ministry goes, your ministry can also be your employment. If you look at it, your whole life and everything you do really is ministry. And yeah, you have to fulfill your own personal obligations and to take care of yourself. However, our ministry begins by yourself before God. And when that's right, all the rest flow in order. Number two, with your wife, when that's right, let me tell you, happy wife, happy life. Number three, your kids. You know what? You gotta spend time with your kids. They will grow up without you if you do not intentionally spend time with your kids. Let them see your relationship with God. Let it be real so that they will model that in their own life and look for a spouse of their own, if they get married, look for a spouse of their own modeled the same way. Number three, your employment, whether secular or spiritual, whatever you're doing to trade your time, your talent, and your effort to receive some type of treasure in return, whether it's your paycheck or your retirement plan or savings that way, and also whatever medical benefits that you get that you and your family will probably need so long as you're here on the face of this earth. And number five, and it's not last but least, it's literally the order of your life in such a way that you can fulfill volunteer work on behalf of God above and beyond that within your family and at your employment, but to actually help let God use you in your efforts here on earth to be a ministry and a witness for Him, whether that's at a church, doing certain ministry activities, working with children in Sunday school or youth ministry. Very, very powerful things to be one of those role models, even if it's just once a week. Very powerful thing. Or whether you're a volunteer at Bible school or university, or whether it's any type of volunteer, unpaid, ministry that you can do. And I believe that part of the reason why there's such a reputation about pastors' kids, PKs, being hellraisers is simply because the pastor may not have his priorities right. And I don't want to be critical of ministers, but ministers may very well be men, and we've known many of them to fall. And if we keep our life, our priorities in order, that doesn't mean that you're running off from your job to go spend time with your wife. No, you've got to fulfill your requirements at work. But don't let work be an excuse not to spend time with your wife or your kids. All right? Number 1, God. Number 2, your wife or spouse. Number 3, your children. Number 4, your work that you get employed with. And number 5, if your work is not ministry or spiritual per se, then you're volunteering in ministry. Thanks for watching.